Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, again, with Commodore Steve Jermy. Steve, welcome back.
Very nice to see you, Pascal, but also to have been able to have the chance to meet you in person at Tbilisi.
Yeah, that was great. We were together at the forum in Tbilisi just 2 weeks ago, and it was great chatting in person. And now it's great to have you back also on online on the channel. And today we want to discuss actually something that also came up in the forum, of course, which is the geopolitics and geoeconomics actually of the current wars that we're seeing. But before that, let me just very quickly do a shout out to your new Substack. But why don't you tell us about it, Steve? It's called Mor Gallos, huh?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I live in the county in the southwest of Britain called Cornwall, and we have a Celtic language. So Mor Gallos is Celtic for sea power. And I'm very interested in the power of the sea and how it sort of plays into all of the things that are going on in the world. It's not the only thing, but I've reinvigorated it, so a bit more time to actually run it now.
Makes good sense for especially for you as a former Commodore and captain of the Royal Navy. So I'm looking forward to this new Substack of yours and reading all of your updates. But now let's go into the topic. The two wars that we are seeing, the Ukraine war and the Iran war. I mean, both of them are going through these ups and downs, and Iran currently seems to be in I think it's a pause. I don't think it's an end, but at least something happened with the MOU. But you're looking also at the economics of it, right? And at the way in which the closure of the Strait of Hormuz impacted not only the war itself, but the long delay of what we are looking at for the next year or two. What's your take?
Yeah, my take is based on a theory that I'm developing, which I call macroenergetics, Pascal, which is the use of energy analysis to do macroeconomic forecasting. And having worked for the last 15 years in the energy sector, but also have studied macroeconomics at postgraduate level, I can sort of see how it all fits together. But the most fundamental and the most important thing, Pascal, is that there is an incredibly close mathematical relationship between the use of oil and GDP. And so as oil use goes up, and so global GDP goes up, and vice versa. And this relationship is mathematically close to 1. It's about 0.95. So what the simple deduction from this is that actually if you take 20% of the world's oil out, or even 13%, which is the 13 million barrels per day out of the Straits of Hormuz, then if that reduction continues over time, that it will have a order of magnitude impact on the global economy, which is similar to 13%. So when you start to model that, then, and I've done this, then you start to look at a very, very significant consequence for the global economy. If the straits were to open tomorrow, then we might be might be less impact, but I see no sign of that. So I'm looking at baked in already, because of the time that the Strait of Hormuz have been closed, a global recession in the order of 5%. That's a severe recession. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it stays open a little bit longer, or even an extended period, that we'll be seeing something which looks more like 10%. 10% is a depression. The height of the global depression in 1929, I think, was in the States at about 15%. But it gives you a sense of the economic consequences. And I think as well, a lot of people say, well, actually, don't worry, the Straits of Hormuz have opened. The problem with maritime logistics is that everything's slow and the lag is incredibly long. So a tanker travels at about the same speed as a bicycle, and oil in the pipelines travels at about something like, at the most, 10 kilometers per hour, 8 miles an hour. So what you can see is that the system is very, very slow. Furthermore, it's mediated by the market, so nobody's in charge. And for all of these reasons, then it takes a long time with the straits opening before we actually see any recovery. When the Evergreen tanker went aground in the Suez Canal, remember that about 5 years ago, Pascal? For every 1 day the Suez Canal was closed, it was about 6 days for the whole of the maritime logistics system to recover. So, for 3 months, let's even assume that it's half of that, and just 3 days to 1. So every 3 months that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, we're looking at 9 months recovery on the other side. So I will be surprised if we don't see significant consequences starting to play out in July, August in terms of further increases in our energy costs and reductions in the supply of those energy costs. And I would also not be surprised if we don't see the consequences of those running well through into next year. I'm quite friendly with a guy called Art Berman. Art's a brilliant oil geophysicist, but also energy commentator. He takes the view, in which I intuitively agree with, is that we won't see a full recovery ever, so that the consequences will be so profound that actually we're looking at a significant notch down in global GDP, which is bound to have impacts across the, well, it'll bound to have impacts in different ways in different locations. I mean, I don't know what it's like in the Far East where you're located, but in Europe, we are critically dependent on oil imports back to the tune of 12 million barrels per day. And those impacts are being felt across the economy. But I'd be curious to hear what it's like in Japan, Pascal. I was talking to a colleague at a conference only the day before yesterday. I'm from Singapore. He said that of oil at the petrol pump has actually doubled in price. And I don't know what it's like there in Japan. You will know better, Pascal.
It hasn't doubled yet to my knowledge, but since I don't drive a car, I don't keep the pump in my eyes like all the time. But it went up significantly, and it is something that actually worries a lot of Japanese politicians very gravely. The Japanese, although at least publicly, have said that since they have the largest petroleum reserves in the world, 250 days, that's the number that they're giving everybody, and they've released some of that. But you can clearly feel how the nervousness in Japan, and also the fact that they went as far as to agree to they asked Russia to buy oil first at the price cap, and when the Russians laughed them out of the room, they came back and said like, okay, fine, we're going to buy at market value. And funnily enough, the Russians were willing to sell them oil. So I don't exactly know what the measures are that the government is taking at the moment, but since Japan is so oil dependent, just like Europe actually, and it is nowhere close to any kind of well, they are. I wouldn't be surprised if they were trying to revive right now the Sakhalin project that they never exited completely, but that was kind of put on hold. But I have no first-hand information about that.
Yeah. No, of the regions in the world and the key players in the world, the country that's by far the best insulated from this is Russia. So Russia is a major oil and gas exporter. It is an autarkic nation with big industrial capacity. So it's the one that will be most insulated. It also economically, although people talk about its impending doom, which they've been talking about for the last 4 years, it has a very low debt to GDP ratio. Things aren't perfect in the Russian economy, but blimey, look at some of the economies in the West, actually. So Russia's the best insulated. So I would say China's pretty well insulated as well, 1.3 billion barrels of oil in a strategic petroleum reserve. So I'd guess that in terms of their overall usage, they're pretty much the same as Japan. Much less so here, and also in the United States. People assume that the United States is an oil exporter. It's an exporter of refined oil products and the lighter oils, but it's a net importer of about 6.5 million barrels per day of heavier oils, which it needs to blend with the lighter oils to actually produce the refined products. So that's why we're seeing, and of course oil is very much a fungible product sold around the world. So as prices go up, they'll go up in the States as well. Because I think this is baked in, the recession, then I think the midterms are lost. I think that the consequences are still arriving, and as they get worse, then the midterms are lost, and that in turn will bear on how the Americans play the Iranian situation. I can see why they're desperate to get the straits open, because I imagine that they're now seeing coming down at the track at them. But to be honest, I think even if the straits are open tomorrow and reliably, then it's too late. The midterms are lost in America with all the consequences that means.
Hey, just a very quick note. The best way to support this channel is by signing up for my free Substack. You can also help with a paid subscription there, or you can get some of our new merch on neutralitystudies.com. Links below. See you there.
So is your interpretation of why the Americans were willing to sign this surrender document for all intents and purposes is that it got very, very clear to them, to the Americans, just how devastating the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is, and the whole thing about, oh no, we managed to have 70 ships pass on the side of Oman and whatnot. I mean, that's a lot of nonsense, or at least nothing that would actually have the impact that you need it to have. So it's basically the recognition that if this continues, it's going to be devastating for everybody, right?
Yeah, it's exactly that. I would imagine the energy secretary has talked to Trump and said, look, we're in deep trouble. The critical oil refinery place in the States is Cushing. And the sort of feedback is that they're down to about 20%. Of course, most of the inventories have gone as well because we've been drawing down on those. So the reason that we haven't seen the impact so acutely, and we have seen them, and if Singapore have paying twice as much at the pump, then they're clearly there. But the reason we haven't seen them is that people have been using inventories, people have been using strategic petroleum reserves, and last but by no means least, China has not been importing nearly as much. Difficult to say why that is, but one thing's for sure, China's not impervious to this, not so much because China hasn't got great reserves. It's rather because China is an economic exporter. And of course, if its key markets in the Far East, which look to me to be very vulnerable, if its key markets in the Far East are starting to collapse because of a lack of energy, then so too will China's export opportunities in those places. So this is as much an interest of China to actually get solved as it is to the United States and to Europe for different reasons.
Yeah, and to the Russians as well, actually. I mean, there's just no interest in anyone in a global depression at the moment. So there is a shared interest of getting out of it. But the question then, of course, is, can you actually open it that quickly? I mean, the two things that are kind of still very, very much unknown is, now that the MOU has been signed, and we are talking today on June the 20th, the MOU has been signed like 2 days ago, and in principle should open the strait immediately, but I don't know what that looks like as we speak of today. And secondly, the other thing is, of course, the different measures that different countries are going to take in order to reduce the impact on themselves. I suppose when all of those come together, this might also change a bit the forecasting that you gave to us, but still the overall picture still stands, which is like a dramatic impact on global GDP. Maybe you can speak to these two things.
Yeah, no, I think the MOU, and I think I heard Alistair describe it sort of what seemed to me to be quite accurately as more an agreement on how to negotiate.
Yes,
is rather than a peace deal. So I think we've still a long way to go on that. And of course, the problem the Americans have is the Israelis, who are rabidly keen to keep the war going. I think what the Israelis have done, they made the same mistake as the Europeans and the Ukrainians, which is to assume that actually if America is on your side, then you're going to win. And I think what we now know is that that's no longer true, but it doesn't seem that thought doesn't seem to have landed or is not consciously understood in either Europe, Britain, or Israel, or indeed, I think for the neocons. America is a very strong military power, but actually it's no longer omnipotent. And in the current circumstances, it's very difficult to see how the Americans could do anything other than to accept the surrender document. I think that again, what they're faced with is an increasingly intense, and I suspect it will play out in July onwards, increasingly intensification of oil shortages. And that will lead, I suspect, to a much harder edge between the United States and Israel, because the United States has been happy to support Israel. And of course, you've got the Israel lobby and those who are keen for the United States support to continue. But at what cost? And if it's at the cost of the American economy and a severe shock to the American economy, I think that'll be a step too far. I don't think it'll be a step too far for Republicans and Democrats. And I think it will change the nature of the debate. So America has it within its gift to stop Israel interference just by cutting off its weapons supply and leaving them solo. And I would have thought the threat of that to the Israelis will be enough to actually bring them into line, but that might not be, and we see that until July. But again, for every extra month, then we're talking about 3 or 4 additional months, and the consequences playing through into next year.
Yeah, the problem though that Iran has on its side is like they insisted that Lebanon is included in the MOU, and Israel seems to be completely utterly unwilling to go along with that. Of course, Israel is also accustomed to, like, what is it now, 75 years of utter impunity. I mean, we must keep in mind that's the country that managed to shoot down and not shoot down, but shoot at even a U.S. military vessel and kill many of U.S. sailors, and the U.S. was still willing to give them impunity and just forget all about it and obfuscate the case and whatnot. They're able to pull off a genocide at the doorsteps of Europe, right? All of these things are possible for Israel, and all Israel usually needs to do is to cry harder when it doesn't work. And it seems to me that they're doing this also now, that they're throwing a temper tantrum about the peace agreement, and also about the criticism coming from Europe, saying that they don't want to talk to the European Union anymore, since Kaja Kallas made a comparison of them with apartheid South Africa. But so Israel is unwilling to go along, but it is part and parcel of the MOU, which Iran insisted on, and Iran is holding the keys to the Strait of Hormuz, and that is clear now. However, Iran also, I mean, China and Russia both wouldn't want this to continue either. So there must be also pressure on Iran to kind of say, like, okay, fine, we will try not to tank the global economy completely. How important do you think is the China and Russia factor on Iran to kind of get this agreement, right? Which I think is correct. It's an agreement of how to get there, but the agreement is kind of, we already opened the strait, while demanding that you live up to some promises, and then we get to a final agreement.
Yep. I think it's a very good question, because I've always thought that actually key to actually getting the Gulf War closed down is getting much better involvement with the Russians and the Chinese. I don't think Europe's got much leverage, I'm afraid, but I think the Russians and the Chinese do. They're both allies to Iran. And it's indeed of their interests that we do pitch the world into a global depression, although both are better insulated from that depression than the rest of us. I think it will. I suspect what will happen is that if I'm right, and as the economic consequences become more acute and more severe and more visible, then I think we're going to see a further shift in opinion in the United States. I thought it was very interesting that Vance was the one who was put up to actually talk about Israel, explain that actually the Americans have done a lot for Israel. They'd paid for everything. They'd paid for 2/3 of the weapons and so on. That to me is a change. Now, the AIPAC lobby may not like that, and some of the neocons may not like it. But actually, even the AIPAC lobby and the neocons, I think, will have limited leverage once a really severe recession takes place. And that's the scenario that I believe is baked in. So in those circumstances, I think the pressure in the United States on the White House in general, and White House in particular, and across the political spectrum, will be to actually bring Israel to heal. From the sound of it as well, and again, I listened a lot to Alistair Crook on this, who of course is cognizant with the Hebrew press. Yes, it's clear that the Israelis are shocked by the shift in politics and the fact that they've been called out by both Trump and Vance. So I suspect there's a lot of internal discussion going on. Doesn't mean to say that if Netanyahu goes, that we'll necessarily get somebody better in place. But nevertheless, I can imagine there's going to be a conversation, political conversations within Israel. I mean, we've heard already from one of the Israeli chief of the general staff, I think it was, or chief of the defense staff, that they need about 6 times IDFs to actually win the wars, or to try and fight the wars that they're fighting, which is clearly impossible. And again, I would hope that the more strategic in Israel is starting to say, we know now that we can't win this war. We can't win a war against we can't win a war against Iran, but furthermore, we can't do anything really without the United States backing. So we have to accept that if we're going to retain the United States backing, we need to be cognizant of the United States economic situation. If they're not, then I suspect that we could see a fairly messy relationship in the remaining years, the remaining months of this year, Pascal.
Right. Yeah, and if I understand you correctly, then you interpret the situation that we are seeing now not so much as a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, but as the outcome of a real economic hurt. And the United States being forced against its will to do this kind of MOU, but having to do it otherwise, the consequences for the rest of the Trump administration are not only going to be bad, but catastrophic. And to avoid that, they are now putting proper real pressure on Israel. So it's not, in your view, this is not make-believe, because that's the other interpretation. It's like, oh no, it's just they're just playing the markets. They just want a break in things, and then prices fall, and the Trump cronies and whatnot, they then all buy these stocks and whatever they can get, and then the next round of the war is going to start again. Everything shoots up, and a lot of people make billions of dollars in profits, and the whole Israel affair is really just make believe. That's the other interpretation. But in that case, you're not much on that one, right?
No, I mean that may have been the case in the over the sort of recent months, but I suspect that what's happened is because this has felt like a phony war, and people have said, "Oh, the Straits of Hormuz have closed. It's perhaps not as bad as we thought. The prices have gone up in petrol and diesel, but perhaps not as bad as we thought." But now I think that as the consequences are becoming clearer, and that people begin to realize that there is this 3-month lag, and it depends where you are. I mean, the lag is less in the Far East because it takes the vessels less time to get to the Far East, but it can be as much as 2 months for vessels to get from the Straits of Hormuz to the United States and to Europe. So the lag is more there. But even so, the fact that this lag is now, the consequences are now here because the lag is now sort of unfolded, and we can see what's happening. And of course, it's not just going to be about the commercial situation, retail prices at the pump. It's about much more than that. And I keep repeating this too often to many of my renewables friends. But the critical fuel in all this is diesel. Diesel is critical for the whole of the world's agriculture, or almost without exception. Diesel is critical for the whole of the world's fishing fleets, almost without exception. It's critical for logistics. All the major vessels run on diesel. And I was at a conference the day before yesterday, and of those vessels which are being bought for the future, 80% of them are being bought on the assumption that they will run on diesel, not on alternative fuels. It's critical for construction. It's critical for almost all of the other energy sectors as well. So I've worked in the offshore wind sector. We're critically reliant on diesel. I haven't worked in the nuclear sector, but it's the same. Construction of nuclear materials.
So, and diesel has to be produced from heavy crude, right? Not from the light one.
Yeah, it does. It does. So the American light oils, which especially those which come from the shale fields, Pascal, fracking fields, do not produce diesel. Diesel, and the critical thing about diesel, it's got incredible power density. So it's incredible power density, and about all of the key things in the all the capital equipments. Where does a solar panel come from? A solar panel comes because somebody mines something in Australia using a diesel-powered JCB. They then run it across Australia to get to a port, probably using a diesel-powered railway. From the port, it goes to somewhere in China using a diesel-powered ship. In China, it's taken to the factory. It's probably using coal. You can see where I'm going. Then take it all the way, and finally, if it's installed in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, your point is even a solar panel is ultimately a diesel generated commodity. So, there you go with like all renewable. Yeah, you can't renewably get the things in place.
Yeah. No, you'll find. I mean, I'm obviously a fan of renewable energy, and but I think the problem is to actually think of these as alternatives that must be competed against each other. What we've got to see is all these different energy sources as part of an overall energy system, and with each has their part to play. But the critical factor at the moment, and I suspect it'll be for at least the next 50 years, will be hydrocarbons to provide the oils to run the other sectors. I mean, if we were going really quickly, we might be able to actually make a major transition in 30 years.
But but you can't do it overnight, and you cannot do it within just a couple of years. So I mean, the importance of diesel and of oil is still just a fact of life.
And it's a hard-edged fact.
Yeah.
I mean,
So what does this then do? I mean, if we then, because if I follow what you're saying, then what it seems to me is that the last 3 months during the war, the price differences that we saw are more or less just the future expectations of the markets that then react, right? Based upon expectations, but not based upon an actual real shortage on the ground, because all of these ships were still in the ocean and the lag that we saw actually worked as a buffer, right? But that's going to change, right? And we're going to see real price changes, not based upon just expectation, but based upon availability of that stuff, right?
Yeah, when you're seeing WTI, that's West Texas Intermediate, and Brent prices, those are futures prices almost all the time. And it's very interesting, the price that are actually for fuels that are arriving, so oils that are arriving, are higher. So I think the figure I heard in Singapore was actually they're paying as much as $200 a barrel for some of the fuels. Again, that's I haven't been able to look at that in detail, but those are prices that are arriving. So the futures markets and the real markets are very, very different things. The same gold as it happens. But the other thing, just as a final PS on oil prices, is that hydrocarbons are responsible not only for diesel and all the critical fuels, but they are fundamentally important in the production of fertilizers, concrete, plastics, and steel. And if you can explain to me how to run a modern society without any of those things, then I'll be all ears. But if what you can deduce from that is that if oil prices go up, then so will the costs of all of those things as well. The one that'll hit us quickest and hardest is fertilizer, I suspect. We're critically dependent on nitrogen. I think it's using the Haber-Bosch process, I think it is. So fertilizers, again, and if you can, as I live in a farming county and a fishing county, as we have got 2 tractors in the county of Cornwall, which is a relatively small county, out of probably thousands that are actually running on an alternative fuel. Everything else runs on diesel. Same for all the fishing vessels. So our complete food system is critically reliant on it as well. So, you can see when I talk like this, why there is this close relationship between economic growth or economic GDP and hydrocarbons. It's close as 1-to-1. So yeah, I think this is going to affect not only the United States situation in Iran, but I suspect as well, Pascal, it will affect the Russia-Ukraine war as well. Interesting.
Do you think it's if there's economic depression is going to hit across the board, then it will impact the ability of the war fighting, actually, like direct impact or indirect?
I think it'll be indirect, but it'll be based around the question, how are we going to afford this? So of course, if you start to see GDP reductions, then of course you're also starting to contraction. Then what you're also starting to see is reduction in tax takes. So the government's abilities to do things are reducing. This will probably show up as well with another complication, which is that as prices rise, and they're rising not due to change in the monetary supply, but changes in input costs. And as prices rise, then of course that'll put pressure on, or that'll probably put pressure on central banks, who classically try to control inflation using monetary policy. And so as they rise, the hawks decide to actually raise interest rates, and so of course that will raise the cost of government money in the bond market. So you've got a double whammy of reducing tax takes at the same time that you're paying more. And this is in the Western economies, you're paying more for debt. It doesn't matter so much for Russia because you only got 70% of your debt up to GDP. But for countries in the West, and I think with the exception of Germany, although they're heading in the wrong way as well, we're all over 100% GDP. So you don't need much of a change in the bond market to suddenly see significant consequences. Very good person to listen to on this is a guy called Luke Groman. He runs a podcast called Forest for the Trees. But actually, he says that when you get to the stage where your government tax takes are below the increasing cost of interest finance for your debt, then you're essentially in a sort of form of quasi Ponzi scheme, because actually you're just going to have to start to print money. And you then get in the situation, do you print money or do you protect your currency? So no, we're in deep trouble, I suspect. And I suspect that the reason that this is going to pay into the Russia-Ukraine war is that the West, Europe, which critically depends on oils and gases, will find itself entering a recession at a time when it's being asked to pay more for defense and more to support Ukraine. And I suspect that will cause a lot of angst in European populations who have been sort of, I wouldn't say, I think they've been propagandized, I'm afraid to say, in a deceptive way.
Yeah, quite heavily propagandized. But the worries that I have now, especially after also having been to another conference after ours to Russia, is that it seems to me that the Europeans are extremely confident in we are winning. Ukraine is winning. Again, like for the last 4 years, the Russians have stalled, the advance has stalled, and now Ukraine is carrying the war to Russia. Every time something in Moscow blows up, the Europeans, stand up and applaud, and they seem not to understand that Russia is now actively thinking about whether it should strike Europe, yes or no. I mean, we are at a completely different phase of this conflagration. And it might get much bigger. And the Russians are getting very, very, very angry because at some point, the one thing that they agreed for the last 4 years was that we keep the war inside Ukraine, right? And whenever it seemed like spilling over into Europe, the Europeans immediately shut it down. Especially that missile, Ukrainian missile that killed 2 farmers, the Europeans immediately shut that down. But they've been salami slicing themselves into carrying the war into Russia, and they seem to be very proud that the salami slicing worked. And the Russians are now at the point where they're saying like, well, there's no more point for us to leave the Europeans out, so they're actively thinking of shooting. I don't know. This takes us a little bit away from the economic aspect, but maybe there's a way of tying these two together. What do you make out of this?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I often think that the political narrative is Ukraine is winning. I said a couple of years ago, my very first podcast with Danny Davis, that the West is being driven by a political narrative and the Russians are being driven by military strategy. And the problem is the political narrative. It doesn't seem to be based on any facts. No. If the Ukraine's winning, it's difficult to understand why, as according to the Institute to Study War, which is pro-Ukraine, that they've been losing ground for at least 36 months and are continuing to lose ground. I've often compared the situation to the Second World War, where it's a bit like saying Germany's winning because it's firing the V1 and V2 rockets into Britain, because they were not pleasant things to have fired into Britain, but it didn't make the slightest bit of difference to the war. The difference, though, as you say, is that I think there is a real risk that the Russians will respond. And if they do respond, the point I made, and people don't seem to be cognizant of, is that they can respond in a sub-nuclear way, but still have devastating damage to Europe, the European energy infrastructure, for example, using missiles against which we have no defense. Mm-hmm. We have no defense whatsoever against the hypersonic missiles and very limited defense against the ballistic missiles. I suspect that the way this will go will be really interesting to see Putin's take on this. I mean, people I'm astonished by how people see him as this sort of devil incarnate, this Hitlerian figure. They just don't seem to have bothered to try to understand him. I've listened to Oliver Stone's interviews of him, 4 interviews of him, and read Philip Strong's book on him. You get a much more nuanced understanding of the man. The thing that came out of that for me is, whatever you think of him, he deserves a lot of respect, huge amounts of respect, because he's exceptionally strategic in my view. I think the balance that he's got is on the one hand, how does he respond to the political pressure, and indeed to the risk that if he doesn't do something, the Europeans will do even more. And on the other hand, that actually, does he see the economics consequences coming that I see coming, in which case, he can afford to be a little bit more cautious in responding, because actually sooner or later the Europeans are going to actually have already damaged their economy using the sanctions that are supposed to damage his economy, and are now about to have the impacts really, really coming much more much more acutely as the economies of the Europe struggle. I mean, Germany is already struggling thanks in no small part to the sanctions that we've put on Russia. You sort of can't make this up. Russia is the major exporter of gas to Germany, but also Russia was producing 40% of Europe's diesel, and I think about 40% of the world's fertilizer. So sanction them is it's like it's a boomerang sanction. It was bound to do more damage to us. I think there's an open question. I'd be curious about your view about whether you think the Russians will respond. If I were Putin, the way that I would, if I had decided to respond, I'd be interested about how I responded and where. And I'd be tempted to, whoever I respond would be to pick up the phone to either to Trump and say that if there are any more of this going on, then we will be responding with attacks on the countries that we think are providing most of the weapons. And I think the three that spring to mind are the E3. It's Britain, Germany, and France. And again, none of those countries have the capacity to defend against a hypersonic missile coming into, for example, Southampton, with great oil storage in Southampton. And the damage that could be done to the West's energy infrastructure would be profound. It would, I wouldn't say take us quite back to the Stone Age, but it would have a profound effect on the way that an economy in the West ran. So, open question. I think I'd probably start with the Americans and say, we've had enough of this. We will be responding. The thing that also needs to be made much more clear to the Europeans is that even if NATO comes in with Article 5, we can't win a war against Russia. I wrote an article in Responsible Statecraft, which is on my Substack, about a year and a half ago, and said NATO could not win a war with Russia. I'm absolutely clear about this. So the problem is that everybody thinks that with NATO on your side, you can win a war with Russia. The reverse is the case. I can take you through that argument if you'd like, but I'd be curious to see what you think about how the Russians might respond.
The problem the Russians have is that even if Europe cannot win a war with Russia, the question to them is, can we win a war with the Europeans? And there's, of course, people like Mr. Karaganov who will say absolutely, but then there's others who will tell you, like, what does winning mean, right? I mean, are we looking at a Second World War scenario where you have to have the Russians march all the way to Berlin? And in this case, also to Paris and London? It's like, I mean, if that's what winning means, then that sort of winning is also off the table for the Russians. So the best case scenario would be both sides would probably not lose, but that then makes the structural conflict even worse. And the one thing the Russians actually tried to get for the last 15, 20 years is the opposite, right? Is a structural solution to the security problem and actually have, Gorbachev's common European home. And this type of approach that we are discussing now would get us into the exact opposite direction. So I think overall, the people who are in charge at the moment still have a strategic interest to keep the war in Europe, keep the war inside Ukraine, but the Europeans are sabotaging that strategy, right, and carrying it into Russia. So the question is how to coerce them into stopping that, or into going again, saying like, okay, we fight it out. And for the Russians, then as soon as you have the Donbass and the strategic places secured, Odessa, maybe yes, maybe no, we don't know. But as soon as you have that, you can stop the onslaught, and then you can live with a de facto kind of wall and division. And that I think was the idea of Russia after being done with the war of attrition, so basically having defanged Ukraine and defanged NATO in large parts. But now the drone warfare is kind of putting that into jeopardy, and there seems to be no effective remedy against these goddamn drones from the Ukrainian side. So the Ukrainians and NATO have found something that can not win the war, but it can significantly damage Russia, and they're happy with that, right? And that's the sick part of this game. That again, they're delighted at the hurt it causes in Russia, and some of these people might believe that will incentivize the Russians to give up. But again, all it does is it gives more power to the people who say we need to carry the war into Europe, and okay, screw the next 50 years with the Europeans, we can fight it out. And so I see it as a huge escalation spiral that we are in at the moment. And the one thing that stands in between is probably the veto from Vladimir Putin to say, like, no, we're not burning all those long-term bridges just yet.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. My guess is that that would be the approach you would take. Although, having said that, I also guessed that Trump wouldn't attack Iran. So can't always get it right. I think that the war that, if this were to be escalated, the war that the Russians would be fighting would not be an offensive war. It will be a defensive war, because in their view, what they're trying to do is to actually maintain to obtain the security, the minimum levels of security they need. And of course, it's always been a defensive war. It was against NATO and NATO expansion. So I think that I have thought for some time that the way that the Russian strategy would be is that they started off, and this, I see their strategy in 5 phases, Pascal. The first was essentially a military support to what was a diplomatic initiative. Rather than any attempt to take Ukraine. And they were prepared to sign. They had opened negotiations with Ukraine on day 2 of the invasion. And were prepared to sign within a month, and had it not been for Boris Johnson and Biden. But then they realized that after that month that the Europeans and NATO were prepared to actually come in on the side of Ukraine, they would have to fight. So we then saw phase 2, which was what we would call in the military retreating contact. So essentially retreat to a defensible line, which was the Sorovenkin line. Phase 3 was what I would call attritional defense, where they defended that line whilst building up the capacity they need to actually fight a proper war, which they did. Phase 4 was attritional offense, and they started to move into the Donbass and into the 4 regions. And I think that they're now probably close enough to actually securing the 4 regions to actually make a decision of either stopping there and or continuing on to include Odessa, which I probably would, although that's not easy, but or perhaps including Novorossiya in toto. So that's the other 4 regions to the west of the minimalist region. So somewhere in there is a minimum security place. But then what we were getting is an exchange, ballistic exchanges, because how would NATO respond if Russians continued in that way and responded against NATO weapons factories, for example, that were being used to develop weapons? I mean, it's difficult to know what Europe would do, because we haven't got the offensive capacity to invade Russia. I mean, quite the reverse. We'd be absolutely, our forces would be slaughtered, even if we could mobilize them, which we can't. So it essentially it becomes a little bit like a tennis match, if you like. We're throwing missiles at each other.
So this is the one thing that Mr. Karaganov says, right? And Karaganov goes very extreme. He says we need to use a tactical nuclear missile in order to bring the realization to the Europeans that this is real and this is not a game. But I don't think, I mean, listening to what Mr. Lavrov and Vladimir Putin said, that they want to go that route because they're very much aware of just how incredibly dangerous that is. And once you start it, you might not be able to end the escalation, right? So if the question I have in my mind is whether the Iran war is actually going to give us the answer. Because what Iran did on a strategic level is it reestablished reciprocity. Iran never threatened the actual survival of Israel or the United States, but it said, like, for everything you throw at us, we know you can throw it at us, you can blow up our things. You know what? We will do exactly the same to you, and we will prove to you that we have the conventional second strike capability to do so. So the one thing that the Europeans now did is they use, of course, Ukraine in order to pretend that they're not involved. Although they clearly are. They even produce these drones. So if Russia actually started and said, like, okay, what, you're droning our factories and our cities, we're going to drone yours, until you get the point that unless you stop your drones, we will continue ours. And so what we might be looking at is then a conventional drone war in which both sides are vulnerable to the other, with the goal of forcing both sides, forcing the other side to stop so that you stop yours. But that, again, is a gamble which would rest upon the assumption that the Europeans are rational. And one thing at the moment I think that the Europeans have proven is that they are reasoning in utterly irrational ways. And I don't think it's a madman strategy. I think they're just clinically ill at the point. I mean, some of the leadership within NATO. So I don't know how whether they will go this way or not. But the one thing Iran did is it reestablished reciprocity. It hammered it back into the heads of a club of countries that is used to do whatever they want and suffer no consequences.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very good point and very well made. I think that what struck me about the Iranian strategy, it was pretty much as I expected. It had three elements: take out the American bases, close the Straits of Hormuz, and actually reciprocal attacks on Israel. And we know from the 12 Days War that they actually did a lot of damage in Israel. So it's sort of, I was mildly surprised that people at the APAC lobby didn't pick that up. But I think the great danger of using nuclear weapons is that you do have two nations, Britain and France, who are both nuclear armed. So there's that danger. Of course,
which actually makes the situation most dangerous for Germany, because I don't think Russia would strike either of the two nuclear places, but it might strike the Germans and then go like, really, Paris? Are you gonna put Paris at risk for Berlin? Are you gonna do that, London? And we all know the answer to that question. No, they won't.
No, I think that's the reason that I think that I think it's extremely unlikely that the Russians would use nuclear weapons, and I think it would be again that sort of level of escalation. Essentially, even if the British and the French responded, well, that's the end of Europe. Who knows where that would go in a world war. I suspect the Americans would absolutely want to keep clear of it. They would absolutely. So I would imagine there would be huge pressure from the Americans on the Europeans to make clear that any sense of a nuclear response would have no support in the United States whatsoever. So I think then you then come to, is it a reciprocity just with drones, or is it reciprocity with conventional missiles, which are ballistic in nature and hypersonic in nature, because there the Russians have a significant advantage over us. I think the other part of reciprocity, of course, is that the Russians also have extremely sophisticated air defense systems, whereas the Europeans do not. So that reciprocity means that actually the Europeans will suffer in the same way that Israel and the United States air bases have suffered. So this is a war which we would struggle to come out with anything other than the loss, I think.
That is true, but the problem we have, or the problem that and by we I mean everybody, I mean the Russians and the European, everybody together, is that drone warfare is notoriously by now difficult to defend against. Enough drones can overwhelm any kind of defense, and we've seen that in the Iran war. We see it now with Ukraine, and these drones are cheap to produce, easy to manufacture. You can decentralized manufacture them, right? They're not all in one factory, so it's almost impossible to take out. So drones have given the ability to continuously strike the other one, and the other one can't really block it properly. Which means that and this needs to stop for the Russians, right? But how to do that in a moment when the other side is still convinced that they're winning, and that again, especially the Europeans, that they can do this with impunity and that they can produce these drones, just ship them to Ukraine, and as long as they're launched from inside Ukraine, everything's going to be fine. So that's the calculus that I think the Russians need to change somehow.
Yeah. Well, again, I think if they were to take the action, I suspect it probably the action that you've described, which is actually to reciprocate with drone. And I suspect there would be a reciprocation in a very focused way. It'd be going after drone factories across Europe. That's the way I'd be thinking about it. But I do think, though, that the get out of jail free card for the world will be that it's get out of jail free card in terms of getting out of war. It is getting into a severe economic recession or worse, and that as that plays into the political debate in Europe, people are really going to say, do we want to really start? Do we want to double spending on defense when we're halving spending on health or social security? you will start to see really, really significant political strife in Europe. I mean, it's interesting already that we're seeing strife elsewhere. I think it's Peru, where there have been riots, I think, in Peru, again, due to, surprise, high energy prices. So as that plays into the European debate, I would like to think that this is a place where there's some cooler heads might actually prevail. There has been a debate already in Europe where one of the European officials has started to talking to Russia. I can't remember who it was, but he or she has been shot down a bit by Merz. But sooner or later, people are going to say, we are in deep trouble here. So should we not be talking to Russia about fuel and energy?
Yeah, of course. Like the other way of playing this, and I think I do hope the Russians have the cool-headedness for this, is to wait it out, because the economic crisis, like, do not disturb your enemy when they're making mistakes, right? So do not disturb them in putting sanctions on you, because again, they hurt the Europeans more, and just play the long game for the regime change over there in Europe. There might be, and I wonder whether we will see that. I mean, for the longest time within Ukraine, the Russians left Zelensky alone because he's actually, he makes so many mistakes that it helps them more. But that might change now. And, the West has already shown that going after heads of states is fine, right? And the Russians might now think of the regime change by Oreshnik kind of option that they have. I do think that they must be pondering that, because a completely new set of leadership within Ukraine might actually make a much bigger difference to Ukraine than it did for Iran, because Iran's strategy was all about keeping the strategy going, even if the heads are taken out. I don't think the Europeans and the Ukrainians work like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I've thought in a similar way. I thought that actually not only might they think about decapitation, it hasn't been very successful in the West, but we're talking about a different circumstance here. But I've often thought as well that, or more recently thought, that it's not impossible that they would open up a second front to the north, in which they would be driving towards second military front. And they've got the military capacity to do this, Pascal, in which they would be driving back down towards Kiev. Because I think actually the loss of Kiev would actually make a lot of people think, if you can imagine European ambassadors and having to leave, and people moving, no doubt they'd sort of head west to Lviv. But I think that will have a significant impact on the war. Quite risky in some ways, but the Russians do have significant overmatch, and they have, they've got about a third of their forces employed on the front line. And we know how desperate the Ukrainian manpower, woman power is. The fact that they're actually, not only are they press ganging men now, they're actually also press ganging women into the army. So it shows you how desperately short they are. And I don't think you can cover all of this by robotics. Notwithstanding the sort of support that they get.
No, but we must. I think, in my view, we must take this apart now and be aware that on the one hand we have the battlefield situation, and the manpower shortage is the battlefield a war, and then we have the drone war, and these two, in a very weird sense, they're disconnected, right? One can run without the other, and vice versa, because they don't impact the same playing field. The drones, in a sense, are much more political that they are military, whereas the shortage of men and so on is all about military capability of the keeping the line wherever it is. And it's really bizarre now that these two are actually quite disconnected.
Yeah. I mean, the drone, if we were to get into a drone war between Russia and Europe, I'm sure we'd lose. I'm sure of it, because again, we're less well prepared. We have we don't have any of our sites well protected. The Russians do. I'm not saying that we couldn't damage Russia. I'm sure we could, but actually, they could do the level of damage they could do to us, knowing as well that they're producing drones at a huge rate. So I suspect we'd lose. I do like to think, though, that Putin will be very cautious on this. And I do like to think that actually, if he were to embark on such an escalation, he would do so first by engaging directly with the White House and saying that this is what he was planning to do. And secondly, that depending on the White House's response, that he would then engage with the E3, talking to all three leaders and saying, we now, and if you continue to support the Ukrainians in this, we will respond. Because again, the question then is, what do the Europeans do? Especially if Trump has said we will not be supporting the Europeans. Essentially, it's three Bambis deciding what they're going to do about, as John Mearsheimer says, about who's not King Kong, but the other great Godzilla. That's this Russian capacity. But again, I'm worried. I'm very worried about the economic situation, but I do see the economic situation might actually lead to the end of these two wars.
True. And in a sense, what I think what we talked about in the beginning is very relevant, that Russia and China also have an interest in not having this global economic crisis. But I do fear that, especially with Russia, the Europeans might be doing things that might change that calculus. If Russia and China ever come to the insight or to the conviction that a global economic crisis will hurt the Euro-Atlantic alliance much more than them and would force an end to stuff, then they might actually be willing to say, like, okay, look, Iran, let's do this all together now. Let's block everything, and we plunge everybody into economic chaos, and we have the longer, we will stick it out longer. I don't know if that is realistic, and I know that especially China, with its trading routes and trading vulnerabilities, will be highly allergic to anything like that. But if the calculus ever changes, because Iran now showed that if you're able to absorb kinetic strikes and economic strikes, you can come out on top if you just have the longer, if you can take the herd longer. And again, China, I don't think that they might be willing to do that, but the Russians at some point might do seriously think about it.
They've already done a little bit, because the Europeans were planning to cut off access to all Russian oil and gas in about a year's time, and the Russians have helped them out by cutting off access now.
They actually got mad at that. We're like, what? You're using energy as a weapon? Anyhow, I mean,
we are very unlucky at the moment, because we are not very. We seem to be in a situation where we've got the most extraordinarily weak set of Western leaders that I can ever remember in my life.
I think you would have to go back quite a couple of generations or centuries in order to get to similarly like a sad crowd of idiots running the continent. But anyhow, I mean, on this jolly note,
on that very happy note, Pascal.
On this happy note, let's remind again everybody that they can find your new Substack, right? Which is the one here called Mor Gallos. Jeremy, where else should people go to find you?
Yeah, I'm planning to look. I'm sort of routinely invited on others. So Glenn, who we met, and Danny Davis, who we met. So there'll be others as well that I'm invited on. But I'm hope to launch a YouTube channel at the end next month, not this. There's too much this month, but yeah, that'd be great. But look, keep up the good work, Pascal. As I say, it was a great pleasure to meet you. Let's hope we have the opportunity to do that in person in the future as well.
Likewise, Steve, it was a great pleasure. And everybody at home, please subscribe to Steve's Substack. Substack is really the best way to support people, not just with money, but just by giving Steve your email address so that he can reach out, even if we get banned on any of the platforms. Same for us here. And Steve, we're looking forward to your YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pascal. Keep up the good work.
You too.